Welcome back to the deep dive. So, you've handed us a stack of sources today that they take a really refreshing step back from all the daily political hot takes.
Mm.
We're steering away from, who said what, and instead we're focusing on something much more fundamental to the health of representative democracy.
Structure.
Exactly. We're diving into the invisible hand that selects who gets to govern.
Yeah, that's right. When we talk about who represents us, we usually get stuck on the rules, right?
Yeah.
Campaign finance, voting rights, candidate selection, that kind of thing.
Sure.
But this dive explores a question that sits just off stage. Who does the system actually work for? I mean, not in theory, but in the gritty day-to-day reality of institutional life.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The core insight here, and it feels almost counterintuitive, is that systems filter. They just do.
Yeah.
Even when no one consciously decided they should.
Yes.
We're looking at how the very structure and rhythm of Parliament, its schedule, its working life,
Yes.
acts as this unintentional but extremely powerful selection mechanism.
Exactly. We're exploring what the sources term a powerful selection pressure.
The selection pressure.
Yeah. Our mission here is to look at the unspoken norms, the working patterns that quietly select for certain types of people. It creates a situation the source material perfectly describes as representation without conspiracy.
Representation without conspiracy.
I like it.
I like that. It's an outcome, not a plot.
It's an outcome, not a plot.
This is where it gets really interesting because it challenges the standard narrative, When we see a lack of diversity, we often look for the smoking gun.
We do.
A deliberate rule that excluded someone, or maybe a personal failure of motivation. But what these sources are making clear is that no one sat down and designed the system to exclude parents, for example.
That's the critical starting point. The filtering doesn't happen through written rules saying you can't be here.
Right.
It happens naturally by what the institution makes easy to sustain and what it makes incredibly hard. And these expectations, which are often just inherited traditions, they do the heavy lifting of selection over time.
So if it's not on the public job description, what are these quiet, unspoken demands the job imposes that create this filter?
Well, if we examine the role as it's actually lived, these patterns are just baked into the rhythm of the institution.
Okay.
They include highly specific demands, the need for unpredictable hours, the regularity of late nights, and the expectation of long stretches away from home.
I want to dig in on that unpredictability because that feels like the central killer here.
It is.
It's not just working hard. I mean, lots of jobs require working hard. It's the constant disruption.
Precisely. We're talking about the fact that crucial votes, especially in parliamentary systems, are routinely scheduled late 10 p.m., 11 p.m., sometimes later.
And that's not malicious.
It's often just an accident of the legislative process. But if you're a representative who lives outside the city, that schedule means you just can't get home that night.
Which means you are forced to choose between seeing your family or being present for a critical vote. And look, doing that once is fine, but if the job requires this constantly, that rhythm dictates who can sustainably participate.
And the sources show this rhythm favors people who can fully absorb that disruption, people with maximum flexibility.
And what does that mean in practice?
In practice, it means it favors people without big, fixed caring responsibilities. It favors people who can easily afford 2 residences, and crucially, those whose partners or families can quietly carry the entire domestic load elsewhere.
So they're essentially subsidizing the public service role.
They are. And that structural advantage, the one conferred by chaos, that ability to absorb disruption, is really the definition of the filter at work.
It is, and that's actually a perfect way to get into our next point, which is the actual cost of this chaos.
Yes, because the filter works by making life unsustainable for specific groups. And we need to be clear. This difficulty is structural. It is not a sign of poor commitment.
Not at all. And if we look at the demographics most affected, it becomes starkly clear.
Absolutely. We're talking people with young families, people caring for elderly relatives, single parents, really anyone who needs even a little bit of predictability to sustain their other commitments.
Whether that's another job, community work, or just
basic self-care?
Right.
Yeah.
But wait, we always hear we need dedicated politicians, people willing to make sacrifices. Isn't that just the price of admission for high-stakes public service?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the core of it.
I mean, doctors, soldiers, they all work intense hours. Why is Parliament different?
Well, in those other high-stakes fields you mentioned, say emergency medicine, there is usually a system in
Like
place.
custom.
Yeah, for shift rotations, regulated rest, boundary enforcement, precisely because the stakes are so high. The institution manages the commitment.
I see. So in politics, the institution doesn't manage the high commitment.
No.
It demands the individual politician constantly manage and absorb the chaos themselves.
Yes. Often without any real support or predictable schedules, and the source material emphasizes a deeply important point here. These challenges do not make someone a worse representative.
No, often the opposite, right?
Often the opposite. Having those real-world commitments, like knowing you have to pick up a child at 5 p.m., that offers vital perspective. But those same commitments make the unpredictable, late-night, always-on environment structurally unsustainable.
The cost is just too high.
The personal cost is too high.
And the consequence of that, as the sources point out, is twofold. First, some incredibly qualified people just never even consider standing for election. They see the system as just incompatible with a normal life.
And second, there's quiet attrition. People who do get in often leave earlier than they planned.
It's not some big resignation over policy.
No, it's a quiet decision that the structural demands are just not sustainable. The system loses valuable experience simply because it refuses to operate on a manageable schedule.
So it creates this self-reinforcing loop where the people who can manage the chaos, they end up defining what the standard of commitment looks like for everyone else.
Which is the perfect bridge to our next section, this odd inversion the sources mentioned.
Odd inversion.
We often hear calls for Parliament to be more professional, yet the institution structurally rewards, well, endurance more than balance.
That idea, the odd inversion, that's powerful. Let's dig into that. What behaviors that we'd see as problematic elsewhere are reframed as virtues in politics?
We celebrate and reward behaviors that signal total dedication, being able to stay late, being able to drop everything, including, family holidays at a moment's notice, and critically, being able to treat your personal life as totally secondary to the institution.
I'm just picturing this in another high-stakes field. If my pilot, before a transatlantic flight, said they hadn't slept properly in 3 days because of work emergencies,
You'd get off the plane?
I would demand they be replaced. If my financial advisor constantly canceled meetings because their schedule was a total mess, I'd fire them.
That is the inversion. In almost every other high-commitment field, those behaviors are warning signs. They signal burnout, poor judgment, unsustainable practice that will eventually lead to mistakes.
But in politics,
In politics, those same behaviors are often framed as the highest form of dedication. It's evidence of a tireless commitment to public service.
so this institutional logic doesn't just filter who gets in based on their lifestyle, it actually shapes the culture. If the only people who thrive are comfortable with confrontation, with extreme unpredictability, well, then those traits start to look like competence.
That's exactly how cultural norms are solidified. If the system rewards an abrasive, always-on style, or just selects against those who prefer methodical, boundary-driven work, then that style becomes the unspoken minimum.
Right.
And the source material highlights that the absence of quieter, more methodical people, or those who value strategic planning over constant firefighting, it's rarely even noticed
Why not?
because the system has learned to function without them.
And that absence of methodical, strategic thinkers, the people who actually thrive on planning, that must have huge downstream effects on policy.
It does.
Which brings us to our next section. Why this structural bias matters beyond just, HR concerns.
This is why the analysis is so crucial. The composition of Parliament affects decision-making in fundamental ways. It influences which problems feel intuitively urgent to members, which trade-offs feel acceptable, and which timelines feel realistic.
Can you give us a concrete example? How does this lack of personal sustainability translate into gaps in governance?
Well, think about long-term planning, infrastructure, climate policy, public health preparedness.
Big, slow-moving issues.
Right. They require multi-year, strategic, methodical implementation, high upfront costs, deferred political benefit. But if the institution is populated mainly by people whose own lives are lived in constant, urgent disruption, the drop everything now model, the culture becomes optimized for crisis management.
Not strategic development.
Exactly.
It's the difference between firefighting and, building fireproof homes. If you're rewarded for the sprint, you're going to struggle to value the marathon.
You've got it.
Yeah.
The source material suggests a structural failure here. If long-term, thoughtful planning is hard for people whose daily lives are defined by disruption, that is not a moral failing of the individual politician.
No.
It is a structural failure of the institution that selected for people optimized for chaos rather than calm strategy. The environment actively undermines the very type of governance we claim to want.
And this leads us directly to that quiet contradiction at the
Mhm.
heart of the system. We constantly say we want Parliament to look more like the country it serves.
Mhm.
We want diversity, better representation from all walks of life.
But we have simultaneously built and maintained a working environment that makes so many ordinary lives with fixed caring roles, predictable sleep, structured time hard to accommodate, or even impossible.
That contradiction is so insidious because it doesn't announce itself. There's no law-blocking participation.
Yeah.
It just persists. It's this constant grinding background hum of incompatibility. It shapes who feels they belong and who quietly decides, you know what, I am too useful outside of this place to sacrifice my sanity and my family for this rhythm.
It creates a powerful institutional logic of selection pressure. And again, this isn't about blaming any individual who succeeds in this environment. They are simply responding to the powerful, often unspoken incentives that exist.
So the focus has to be on the structure.
The focus, if we want change, must be squarely on the structural environment itself.
So let's bring this back to where we started. These working patterns, the late nights, the constant disruptions, the reward for endurance, they weren't deliberately designed in the first place.
They're accidents of tradition, of inertia.
So what if we treated them not as immutable facts, but as something we could fundamentally redesign?
That is the essential concluding question we want to carry forward for you, the listener. We often ask how to reform the rules of debate or how to redraw electoral boundaries.
Right, the big obvious stuff.
The big stuff. But the deeper, more profound question raised by these sources is whether redesigning the sustainability of the job, the very rhythm of Parliament, could make the institution itself better aligned with the decisions it's meant to make.
So if we fix the chaos that excludes methodical people,
Perhaps the quality of governance, the ability to plan long-term, improves naturally.
a truly fascinating angle to consider. Thank you for walking us through that deep dive into what you called institutional gravity. For you, the listener, maybe think about that this week. Where in your own life or your own organization do unintentional patterns filter out valuable perspectives simply because the timing or the rhythm is wrong? That's it for this week. We'll see you next time.